Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on something pretty heavy, PTSD and how to heal from it. We'll be looking at Inner Balance Red Print's YouTube video called How to Heal from PTSD and Live Your Best Life. And, one of the things that really stood out to me from the video is how PTSD isn't just, a feeling, it really messes with your brain, like physically changes it.
Yeah, that's one of the big takeaways for me too. The video talks about PTSD affecting the parts of your brain that deal with stress and emotions.
Yeah.
Like it basically rewires them, which is why people with PTSD can be so sensitive to triggers and, have such a hard time with all the symptoms.
Right. It's almost like your brain's alarm system is stuck in the on position. So recognizing that PTSD has this physical side is really important, wouldn't you say?
Oh, totally. It helps people realize that, it's
Ah.
not their fault and that it's not some weakness or character flaw. It's an actual physical change in their brain. And that can really help people, feel less ashamed and more willing to actually reach out for help.
So let's talk about recognizing PTSD. What are some of the signs?
Well, the video makes this really interesting point that it's not just about directly going through something traumatic. Like you can actually develop PTSD from witnessing something awful too.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that really changes who we think of as being at risk.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the symptoms themselves can be so different from person to person, right? I mean, the video mentions things like flashbacks where you feel like you're reliving the trauma, or sudden intense anxiety that just hits you out of nowhere. And then there are the intrusive thoughts that you just can't seem to shake.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that these symptoms can affect every part of your life. Your relationships, your work, your sense of safety and well-being.
Yeah.
Trying to just tough it out on your own can really backfire.
So let's say someone's listening to us and thinking, hey, this sounds a lot like what I'm going through. What's the first step? Who do you turn to for help?
Well, there are a lot of professionals who can help. Psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, social workers. It can seem overwhelming.
I know. So finding the right person for you is key.
Exactly. It's like trying on shoes, You don't just buy the first pair you see. You want to make sure they fit right and you feel comfortable in them.
So how do you know when you found the right therapist?
Well, a good question to ask yourself is, do you feel heard? Do you feel understood by this person? Does their approach make sense to you? And most importantly, do you feel safe with them?
That makes a lot of sense. It's such a personal thing, and you really need to feel comfortable opening up.
Yeah. And once you've got that good connection with a therapist, you can start exploring all the different ways to approach therapy.
And speaking of approaches, the video calls it a therapy toolbox. It seems like there are a ton of options. We've got CBT, EMDR, art therapy, music therapy. It's almost like a buffet of healing modalities. But how do you choose with so many choices?
Well, it really comes down to what works best for you as an individual. Some people find talk therapy, like CBT, is really helpful for challenging negative thoughts that go hand in hand with PTSD, while others might connect better with EMDR, which focuses on processing traumatic memories in a different way.
Right. I've heard EMDR can be really good for those really vivid flashbacks that feel so real and disturbing. It's like helping your brain refile those traumatic memories so they don't keep popping up uninvited.
Exactly. And then there are creative approaches like art and music therapy, which can be amazing for people who have trouble expressing their feelings through words. It's all about finding a way to process the trauma that feels safe and accessible.
So for someone out there considering therapy, what advice would you give them?
Be open to trying different things. Do some research and trust your gut. It's your healing journey, and you deserve to find an approach that makes you feel empowered and helps you move forward.
So far, we've been talking a lot about how PTSD affects people on an individual level, but the video also points out how much it can impact relationships.
Oh yeah, absolutely. PTSD doesn't just stay with the person who experienced the trauma. It ripples outwards and affects everyone around them too.
Think about it trying to live your life when your nervous system is constantly on edge, like on high alert all the time, scanning for danger. That makes it really hard to be fully present in relationships, even with the people you love the most.
I can see how that would create a lot of tension and misunderstanding. It must be so hard for loved ones to really grasp what someone with PTSD is going through.
It is. And that lack of understanding can lead to, feelings of isolation and frustration on both sides. The partner without PTSD might feel like they're walking on eggshells, never knowing what might set off a reaction. And the person with PTSD might start to feel like they're a burden or that nobody really gets it.
So how do you bridge that gap? How do you even begin to communicate about something so complex? Well, the video really stresses the importance of communication. It's about creating a safe space where both people can learn about PTSD and how it shows up. The person with PTSD can talk about their triggers and what makes them feel safe. And their partner can learn how to be supportive and understanding without judgment.
So it's about building empathy and understanding rather than, blaming each other.
Exactly. And it's really important to remember that healing takes time. There are going to be ups and downs, good days and bad days. Patience, compassion, and a willingness to learn and grow together are so important.
The video also talks about the guilt and shame that so often come with PTSD.
Oh yeah, I see that all the time in my work. It's so common for people to blame themselves for what happened, to feel like they should have done something differently or that they're weak for having these symptoms. But it's so important to remember that PTSD is a normal response to something completely abnormal. It's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of resilience. It's your body's way of trying to protect you from more harm.
That's a good way to put it. So how do you help people overcome those feelings of guilt and shame?
Well, therapy can be a huge help in working through those really deep-rooted emotions. It gives you a safe space to acknowledge those feelings, process them, and eventually let them go. It's about reclaiming your power and recognizing that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength.
The video also touches on PTSD in kids and teenagers.
Right.
How is it different in younger people?
Well, the core symptoms of PTSD are pretty similar across all ages, but how they express those symptoms can be very different in kids. Instead of talking about their distress, they might act out or show changes in their behavior. They might become more clingy, have trouble sleeping, experience nightmares, or even start wetting the bed again. Sometimes they might even regress in developmental milestones.
So instead of those classic flashbacks, a child might start sucking their thumb again or insist on sleeping with a nightlight.
Exactly. They might also have a hard time focusing in school. Their grades might drop, or they might withdraw from social activities. It's really important for parents, teachers, and caregivers to be aware of these signs and to seek professional help if they see any major changes in a child's behavior.
Another connection the video brings up is the link between PTSD and substance abuse.
Right.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure. Sadly, it's pretty common for people with PTSD to turn to drugs or alcohol to numb the pain and escape the really tough emotions that come with trauma. It's a way of self-medicating, but in the long run, it just makes things worse. Substance abuse can actually make PTSD symptoms more intense, making it even harder to heal and move forward.
So it becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it can. And that's why it's so important to tackle both the PTSD and the substance abuse at the same time. Treating one without the other is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
So what does a more integrated approach look like?
Well, it usually involves a combination of things like therapy, medication management, and support groups. Therapy can help people work through their trauma, develop coping skills, and address any underlying mental health conditions that might be feeding into the substance abuse. Medication can help manage things like anxiety, depression, and insomnia, which can then make it easier to participate in therapy and make positive changes. And support groups are great because they offer a sense of community and connection, which is so important for people who are struggling and feeling alone.
That makes sense, a more holistic approach, but I know that a lot of people with PTSD really struggle with the idea of reaching out for help.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who's hesitant to take that first step?
I'd say you're not alone in this. There are people who care about you and want to help. Reaching out is not a sign of weakness. It takes real courage to face your pain and ask for support. And remember, there's always hope. Healing is possible.
I love that. It's not about getting over the trauma, but about learning to live with it in a way that lets you find joy and meaning again.
Exactly. And that actually leads us to the next part of the video, which is all about thriving with PTSD.
I love that idea of thriving with PTSD. It's so powerful. It's like shifting the focus from just getting by to actually living a good life. What really resonated with you about this part of the video?
What really stood out to me was how the video makes it clear that thriving with PTSD isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. It looks different for everybody. There's no set path or checklist. It's really about figuring out what brings you joy, what gives your life meaning, and then finding ways to bring those things back into your life.
Right. It's about rediscovering those parts of yourself that maybe got lost or pushed aside because of the trauma.
Exactly. And it often involves a lot of things we've already talked about, the therapy, medication, if you need it, support groups, finding healthy coping skills, and really nurturing those relationships that bring you love and support.
The video also talks about self-care. What are some specific things that people with PTSD can do to take care of themselves?
Well, sometimes it's the simple things that make the biggest difference, like making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, and moving your body regularly. It's easy to let those things slide when you're struggling with PTSD, but they can really help you feel better overall. And then there are things like mindfulness meditation and spending time in nature, which can really help calm down your nervous system and bring you a sense of peace.
It's like giving your mind and body the tools they need to heal and recharge, right? What about creative outlets? The video mentions those too.
Oh, yeah. Creative expression can be so healing for people with PTSD, whether it's painting, writing, dancing, playing music, or something else entirely. Doing something creative lets you express your emotions in a healthy way. It can be such a powerful outlet for dealing with trauma and finding beauty even in the midst of pain.
And sometimes it's not even about doing something, it's about just being. The video talks about how powerful connection can be not just with people, but with animals too.
Right. The unconditional love you get from a pet can be incredibly soothing for someone with PTSD. Animals don't judge or criticize, they just offer their presence and affection, which can be really grounding and reassuring. There's actually research that shows that interacting with animals can lower stress hormones and make people feel happier.
It's like they give you a sense of safety and security that's hard to find sometimes, especially when you're dealing with trauma.
Exactly. And even if you can't have a pet, there are other ways to connect with animals. You could volunteer at an animal shelter or just spend some time watching animals in nature.
You know, the video also touches on some of the newer treatments for PTSD, things like virtual reality therapy and neurofeedback. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit more about those?
Sure. So virtual reality therapy is a really interesting approach that lets people face their trauma in a safe and controlled way. It's kind of like a high-tech form of exposure therapy where you gradually re-experience the traumatic event in a virtual world. This can help you become less sensitive to the triggers and lessen the intensity of your emotional response.
It's like dipping your toes back into the water without feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. And then there's neurofeedback, which is another promising treatment. It's basically training your brain waves to be more balanced and regulated. It's like a workout for your brain, helping you learn how to calm down those overactive stress responses and promote relaxation and focus.
There are so many new and exciting things happening in the field. It feels like there's a lot of hope for people with PTSD.
There is. And like the video says, the key is to create a PTSD management plan that's tailored to you. It's not one size fits all. It's about working with your therapist and other healthcare providers to figure out what your specific triggers are, develop good coping strategies, and build a support system that meets your needs.
It's about taking charge of your healing journey and creating a life that feels safe, joyful, and fulfilling.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to go through this alone. There are resources available, people who understand, and communities that are ready to support you.
Well, this has been a truly insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And for our listeners out there, I hope this deep dive has given you some helpful information, a sense of hope, and maybe even some ideas about what your own healing journey could look like.
You're welcome. And remember, there's always hope healing is possible, and you are not alone.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep reaching out for support. You've got this